In our programme tonight, the guard who's been jailed. A former prison officer is sentenced to 3.5 years for beating up teenage boys.
And this morning, as I was driving up, I was saying to myself that it's closure, and I'm also going to walk that little 14-year-old boy out of that cell and out them prison gates. And I pray from today that those feelings are dealt with.
His victims described him as a monster and a psychopath. Good evening. A former prison guard who brutally and repeatedly beat up teenage boys at a juvenile detention centre in South Gloucestershire has today been sentenced to his own term in jail. Dozens of men who suffered at his hands in the 70s and 80s gathered at Bristol Crown Court to hear the judgment. Patrick Devaney had been found guilty of misconduct in public office, and the judge ordered that he serve 3.5 years, half in custody, the other half on licence. Cheryl Dennis reports.
All grown up now, these were some of the young boys who'd been abused at the hands of Patrick Devaney. It's 5 years since police first started looking into his conduct during the 70s and 80s.
I had to sit down, tell my children, because I didn't want them to find out through other means. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do.
In all, 22 victims gave evidence against Devaney, who'd served as a prison guard at what was Eastwood Park Detention Centre between 1970 and 1983. 17 witness impact statements were read out in court. It was a room full of victims who'd come to see their abuser face his punishment. Delivering his sentence, the judge called Devaney a cruel man who'd taken sadistic pleasure in routinely abusing boys for whom he was responsible. He called it psychological taunting and torture, adding he didn't think for a moment that the word torture was too strong.
He might have got a bit longer, but this isn't about me or any individual here. It's about justice for the thousands of children that he abused over the years.
This highlights that institutions should be monitored more closely.
The judge said even by the harsh standards of the time, Devaney's behaviour had been particularly extreme.
Even though justice has been served and he's been sent away, the memories of every single one of us will still be here tomorrow and forevermore, like, you know.
I thought I'd sort of moved on from it. I thought my life had, like I've got over it. But being in there today, it brought me to tears.
I'm not going to hide away from anybody because of his behaviour. And I feel for everybody here today, we've got justice and we should all walk away holding our heads up high.
At the time, some of the boys had tried to speak up. 50 years on, they finally had their voices heard. Cheryl Dennis, BBC Points West, Bristol.
Patrick Devaney was known in the 70s as Patrick Devaney. One of his victims said today that his sentencing meant that he could finally let out the 14-year-old boy inside him who'd been locked up for the last 46 years. Scott Ellis has been speaking to some of those who spent time at Eastwood Park.
One victim described Patrick Devaney as just nasty and sadistic. The treatment was brutal. Another recalls an absolute monster, a psychopath, a thug who assaulted people on a daily basis.
Many of the youngsters have been in and out of Eastwood Park.
Alan Andrews entered Eastwood Park in 1977, aged 14. Although he was just a boy at the time, he can still recall Devaney's punishments.
His main one, he had a big rubber piece of rubber called Mabel, and he used to make you all bend down on the monkey bars, and he'd smack you on the backside with it.
I got a beating off it.
Ron and Andrew, who were also detained at Eastwood Park, remember Mabel and the Sixer.
He would line 30, 40 of us up on the wall bars, touching the bottom bar, bent over with our backside stuck in the air, and he'd walk up and down with his cricket bat, beating every single one of us. He'd run out of breath, hitting us with his cricket bat, the Sixer.
Yeah, but Devaney will never be forgot. He was the worst one of them all. The worst of the worst.
Devaney's actions came about at a time of the short, sharp shock treatment for young offenders. It's a bygone era now, but one that has finally caught up with this 81-year-old. Scott Ellis, BBC Points West, Bristol.